Most people think retirement is decided by a magic age. They think it happens at 59 and a half when a penalty disappears. They think it happens at 62 when Social Security becomes available. They think it happens at 65 when Medicare arrives. They think it happens in the 70s when required minimum distributions start forcing money out of retirement accounts, whether you like it or not. I have spent enough time around money to tell you something most people do not hear until it is too late. The most dangerous year in retirement planning is often the year that looks the least dramatic. It is 61, not because the government sends you a letter, not because a switch flips that day, not because your life looks different when you blow out the candles on the cake. It matters because 61 is often the last clean year in which you can still shape the machine before the machine begins shaping you. That is the real story. Retirement is not won by the person who simply saves the most. Retirement is won by the person who understands when the system is silent, when it starts whispering, and when it starts issuing commands at 61. For many families, the system is still mostly silent. At 62, Social Security enters the room. At 63, Medicare begins watching your income through the rearview mirror. Then later, the tax code stops asking what you want and starts telling you what comes next. That is why I want to speak plainly today. If you are near 60, or if you have already crossed it and still have some flexibility left, this is not a lecture about birthday milestones. This is a conversation about control. This is a conversation about the final stretch in which a careful household can still decide what their retirement will feel like, what tax brackets will dominate the next 30 years, how much room they will have to maneuver later, and whether they will spend old age making deliberate moves or spending half their time reacting to traps they never saw coming. When I look at a good retirement plan, I do not first ask how large the account balance is. I ask a much harder question: who will be in charge of the next 20 or 30 years? Will it be the family? Or will it be the sequence of rules layered on top of that family? That sounds abstract until you put real money next to it. Imagine a couple with a large traditional IRA, some money in a brokerage account, a smaller Roth account, decent health, and several years before full retirement age. At 61, they can still decide how much to convert, how much capital gain to recognize, whether to keep taxable income low enough to preserve health, insurance subsidies if they are not yet on Medicare, and how much pre-tax money to move out of future danger while federal brackets are still manageable. At 63, the same move may carry a shadow price because higher income can feed into Medicare surcharges 2 years later. At 62 and beyond, Social Security enters the emotional and practical conversation, even if they delay claiming, because now every decision is measured against what their future benefits might do, how those benefits could become taxable, and what that means for the rest of the income map. At 73 or 75, depending on birth year and the applicable rule, the freedom narrows again because required distributions begin to occupy bracket space before the family has even decided what kind of year they want. That is why 61 matters. It is not glamorous, it is not marketable. That does not produce the dramatic language that financial television loves. But if you understand capital allocation, you immediately understand the power of a clean window. The best deals in life often appear before the crowd notices they are deals. The best planning windows work the same way. The crowd gets excited when the rule becomes visible. The intelligent family moves before the rule becomes loud. That is the mindset I want you to adopt. Do not think of 61 as a waiting room before retirement. Think of it as an operating table. This is where you set the structure. This is where you decide whether future tax brackets will be mild or punishing. This is where you choose whether later withdrawals will feel intentional or forced. This is where you create space. And space in retirement is worth a great deal more than people realize. When I was younger, I learned that the largest financial errors are rarely caused by one giant catastrophe. They are usually caused by a chain of small decisions made in the wrong order. People think the enemy is a market crash. Very often the enemy is a perfectly ordinary year handled carelessly. A year where income could have been repositioned but was not. A year where a Roth conversion could have been completed at a lower rate but was delayed. A year where appreciated assets could have been harvested intelligently but were ignored. A year where a household could have coordinated taxes, healthcare, and future income streams as one system but instead treated them as separate chores. That is how people drift into expensive retirements, not poor retirements, expensive retirements. And there is a difference. A family can have real wealth and still run an expensive retirement if taxes, premiums, and forced distributions slowly take more than they should. The tragedy is that the money is often lost without producing any joy. It goes out the door not to improve life, but simply because nobody made the crucial moves while the window was open. I want to make the case in a way that is impossible to forget. 61 is the last year, for many people, when your retirement can still be designed in a clean room. There are 4 reasons. The first is that Social Security has not yet arrived to complicate the mental map. The second is that Medicare's income look-back has not yet begun to cast a shadow over each tax move. The third is that required minimum distributions are still years away, which means the future can still be edited. The fourth is that if you are no longer working full-time or are scaling down, your taxable income may be low enough to run several valuable strategies together instead of one at a time. Those 4 forces create an unusual form of leverage, and leverage is what I care about. Not action for its own sake, not cleverness for its own sake. Leverage, a smart move at the right time can change the economics of the next 30 years. A smart move at the wrong time may do little. A smart move missed entirely can become a permanent regret. Let us begin with the first force at 62. Social Security becomes available. Now, let me be careful here. Eligibility itself does not force you to claim. In many cases, delaying can still be the better lifetime decision, especially for the higher earner in a married household who is effectively purchasing a larger survivor benefit by waiting. But eligibility changes the psychology of the table before 62. Social Security is not a live option in the current year. You can plan without it as an active piece. After 62, it is always present. Even if you delay, even if you swear you will not touch it yet, it sits in the room and starts influencing every discussion. Should you convert more this year or less? Should you realize gains now or later? Should one spouse claim early while the other delays? Should you keep income low for one purpose or accept more current tax to reduce future tax? That is when retirement planning stops feeling like a clean blueprint and starts feeling like a negotiation among competing benefits. There is another layer. Federal tax law can subject part of Social Security benefits to income tax once combined income rises above certain thresholds, and those thresholds for joint filers have been stuck for decades rather than rising with inflation. People who assume benefits are automatically tax-free are often shocked when other income drags more of those benefits into the tax net. The numbers matter less than the principle. Once Social Security enters your life, $1 is no longer just $1. An extra withdrawal from a traditional IRA can affect ordinary income. That higher income can change how much of your benefits become taxable. That in turn can alter your effective marginal rate. And suddenly, a move that looked modest on paper feels much more expensive in practice. This is what ordinary people mean when they say the system feels slippery. It is not that the numbers are impossible. It is that the interactions multiply. At 61, for many families, that particular layer of complexity is not yet active. You still have one more year in which to make meaningful tax and portfolio decisions without every path running through the Social Security maze. That clean separation has real value. A good planner sees it immediately. A careless one ignores it because nothing visible is forcing attention yet. Now let us add the second force. Medicare does not merely ask whether you are over 65. It also asks what your income looked like 2 years earlier when determining whether you owe income. Related monthly adjustment amounts on Part B and Part D for 2026. The first IRMAA trigger begins above $109,000 for an individual return or $218,000 for a joint return, using income from 2 years prior. What matters is not simply the threshold. What matters is the shadow at 61. A large Roth conversion may create current tax, but it usually does not yet echo into future Medicare premiums, the way a similar move can once you have entered the relevant look-back years. At 63, the same conversion may effectively carry a second price tag. That second price tag is what undisciplined planning misses. And shadow prices are some of the most dangerous prices in finance because people do not feel them at the moment of decision. A visible tax bill gets attention. An invisible future surcharge often does not. Yet your household budget does not care whether the damage was obvious or hidden. Money is money. When I evaluate a retirement plan, I always ask what costs are visible and what costs are deferred. Most families pay attention to the visible ones. Intelligent families go hunting for the deferred ones. IRMAA is exactly that kind of cost. It is not dramatic enough to dominate cocktail party conversation, but over years, especially for couples, it can quietly drain a meaningful amount of money for no improvement in quality of life. That is why I call 61 a control year. You are not simply avoiding tax, you are choosing when to recognize income in a way that may reduce future tax and future premiums at the same time. That is a different level of thinking. That is not paycheck thinking. That is owner thinking. Now let us move to the third force. Required minimum distributions are among the easiest retirement threats to underestimate because they show up late. People see late threats and assume they can be handled later. That is not how compounding works. By the time the visible problem arrives, the hidden setup has already been in motion for years. Current law pushes the RMD starting age to 73 for many retirees, and for people born in 1960 or later, the applicable age is 75. That sounds generous. People hear those later ages and feel relief. They think the government has given them more time, which is true. What they miss is that more time is only useful if you use it. If a family spends that extra time doing nothing, then the delay does not solve the problem. It merely lets the eventual problem grow larger. A big untouched traditional IRA in your early 60s is not just a balance. It is a future tax schedule waiting to happen. Every year that money remains inside the pre-tax bucket, you are leaving open the possibility that later forced withdrawals will collide with Social Security, collide with Medicare surcharges, and consume bracket space that could have been used more intelligently years earlier. I have seen people reach their 70s with respectable balances and almost no flexibility. That is a terrible combination. They are not poor. They are boxed in. They do not need all the money the rules are forcing out. They do not enjoy paying the tax. They do not enjoy the paperwork. And by then, any Roth conversion they attempt is layered on top of income they were already forced to recognize. That is why late planning feels so unrewarding. The degrees of freedom are gone. Retirement should become more flexible as wisdom grows. For many households, it becomes less flexible because they postponed decisions when the runway was wide. That is the fourth force. The income layer, the years around 61, can create an unusual tax planning environment because earned income may have declined or stopped, yet the full stack of later retirement. Income complications has not arrived that can allow a household to do several things in the same year. They may convert part of a traditional IRA into a Roth. They may realize capital gains in a taxable account deliberately rather than accidentally. They may structure income in a way that preserves eligibility for health insurance support before Medicare if they are relying on aka marketplace coverage and their circumstances qualify. They may decide how much taxable income to recognize now instead of letting future decades dictate the number. That kind of layering is powerful. Most people think of retirement planning as a checklist. I do not. I think of it as a traffic system. One lane is ordinary income, another lane is capital gains, another lane is future Medicare premiums, another lane is Social Security taxation, another lane is required distributions. At the wrong age, these lanes begin colliding with one another at 61. The intersection is often still quiet enough for you to direct traffic. Later, the city is already congested. And that difference between directing traffic and sitting in traffic is a very expensive difference. This is the place where I want to make a deeper point. Retirement is not merely a math problem. It is an identity problem. During your working life, the story is simple. You work, you earn, you save, you defer, you build. That feels noble and productive. The account goes up and you feel reinforced. Then one day the phase changes. You are no longer mainly an accumulator. You are becoming a manager of flows. That shift unsettles people more than they admit. They do not only fear running out of money, they fear changing identities. They spent decades proving discipline by not touching the money. Now wisdom may require touching it on purpose. That feels backward to them. The household that fails at this stage is often not the household with the weakest spreadsheet. It is the household that cannot emotionally graduate from saver to allocator. That is why 61 is so important. It is not merely a tax year. It is the final year in which you can train yourself to think like the steward of a system rather than the employee of one. You are no longer asking, how do I postpone every decision? You are asking, which decisions made now increase my future freedom? That is the identity reversal. And if you do not undergo it willingly, the system will perform it for you harshly later. The system does not care whether you feel ready. It simply begins introducing rules one after another until your options narrow. A disciplined retirement requires an adult answer to an adult question. Am I still trying to preserve every account in its current shape, or am I willing to restructure the machine so the machine serves me better later? That is what great capital allocators do. They do not worship the current arrangement of assets. They rearrange them when rearrangement improves the long-term outcome. Now let us talk about what that looks like in the real world. Suppose a couple is 61 and 60. They have done many things, right? They saved into traditional retirement accounts for years because that was the easiest route through the working decades. They have a respectable brokerage account. They have some cash. They have a smaller Roth balance because earlier in life they were too busy building to think much about future tax diversification. They are healthy enough to imagine a long retirement. They are not trying to become rich overnight. They are trying not to build a foolish retirement after a wise working life. This is the kind of household I like. They are disciplined. They are teachable. They do not need drama. They need clarity if they treat 61 as an ordinary holding year. Here is what often happens. They wait. They tell themselves they will handle taxes later. They tell themselves Social Security can be sorted out once they are eligible. They tell themselves Medicare is a problem for the future. They tell themselves RMDs are far away. In other words, they say what nearly everybody says when a problem is financially important but emotionally unscheduled. Then the sequence begins. Social Security enters the conversation. Medicare look-back years begin to matter. Large traditional balances remain large market gains inside the pre-tax bucket, create future taxable pressure, required distributions inch closer. And the family slowly moves from proactive design to reactive defense. That path feels normal because it is common. It is still a mistake. Now imagine the same household using 61 correctly. They begin by measuring life as it actually is. Not as they vaguely assume it is. They determine what they need to spend. Not in fantasy, not based on a commercial, but based on the life they would truly like to fund. They separate essential spending from discretionary joy. They identify whether they are relying on marketplace insurance before Medicare and how income levels interact with that decision. They map every account by tax character rather than by institution. They stop saying, we have money at this brokerage and money in that IRA. Instead, they say, we own taxable dollars, pre-tax dollars and tax-free dollars, and each dollar behaves differently when spent. That is the first sign of maturity. Money that looks identical on a statement can behave completely differently on a tax return. The family that sees this starts to think clearly. The family that does not will continue to make crude decisions based on balances rather than consequences. Next, they decide which tax bracket they are willing to occupy deliberately, now to avoid uglier brackets later. This is where many people lose courage. They become so eager to avoid current tax that they unknowingly volunteer for larger future tax. That is false economy. I have never admired a decision merely because it postponed a bill. I admire decisions that reduce total lifetime friction. Sometimes that means paying some tax now while the terms are better. A sensible Roth conversion is not an act of surrender. It is a purchase. You are buying future simplicity. You are buying future flexibility. You are buying room for later years when your options may be fewer. The same is true of deliberate gain harvesting in a taxable account when your income structure makes it attractive. Again, the specific move depends on the facts. The principle is what matters. At 61, you can often decide which income to recognize, how much of it to recognize, and why. Later, more of those decisions become entangled. That is why the year is valuable. Not because one tactic is magical, because multiple tactics can still be coordinated cleanly. I want to say something else that many people need to hear. A retirement plan is not complete merely because it minimizes tax. Tax efficiency is important, but it is not the highest good. The highest good is controlled freedom. That means a plan that lets you pay reasonable tax, maintain healthcare stability, preserve flexibility for later life, absorb surprises without panic, and support the actual life you want to live. A plan that wins on paper but leaves you anxious every time you need to touch an account is not a finished plan. A finished plan has emotional logic as well as mathematical logic. That is why I care so much about the years just before the system becomes noisier. If a family uses 61, well, they do more than improve the spreadsheet. They improve their emotional stance toward retirement. They no longer feel like trespassers in their own money. They begin to understand why one account should be touched carefully, why another account should be preserved as an emergency valve, why future Social Security decisions need to be coordinated rather than improvised, and why reducing future pre-tax pressure can make the 70s calmer rather than more crowded. That emotional clarity has value. It reduces second guessing. It reduces the feeling that every withdrawal is a mistake. It reduces the temptation to let inertia make decisions that should have been made consciously. This is where the blueprint matters. If I were sitting across from a thoughtful household near 61, I would not hand them a gimmick. I would give them a sequence. First, identify the real spending target for the next several years, with enough honesty to separate lifestyle theater from genuine priorities. Second, map every resource by tax treatment, not by logo or account statement. Third, project the next several years before Social Security, before Medicare, IRMAA becomes relevant, and before required distributions begin to dominate the map. Fourth, decide which years are the cleanest years for action. Fifth, choose a deliberate range for taxable income, not the lowest possible number, but the most useful number. Sixth, evaluate whether partial Roth conversions, strategic capital, gain recognition, and healthcare. Subsidy coordination can be layered intelligently. Seventh, protect optionality by preserving some tax-free, flexibility for late life shocks, large expenses, widowhood, or support for children and grandchildren. Eighth, coordinate all of this with the likely claiming pattern for Social Security, especially if one spouse's delay meaningfully enlarges the eventual survivor benefit. That is not a trick. That is a system, and systems age better than tricks. The reason I like systems is simple. A trick solves a local problem. A system reduces the chance of repeated mistakes at 61. You are not trying to win this year alone. You are trying to reduce lifetime regret. If you think in systems, you naturally ask different questions. What happens to our bracket space when required distributions arrive? How much future tax concentration are we carrying in the traditional accounts? How much freedom do we have if one spouse dies first and the surviving spouse moves to single tax brackets? How much healthcare cost sensitivity are we building into the plan unnecessarily? How large a one-time expense can we absorb without being pushed into a bad income year? How dependent will we be on one lever later if we fail to diversify our tax exposure? Now, these are mature questions, and mature questions lead to better retirements. The childlike question is, how do I pay the least tax this year? The adult question is, how do I structure the next 30 years so fewer years become traps? That is the soul of this entire discussion. The market will do what it will do. Congress will change some things and leave others untouched. Medical needs will evolve. Families will surprise you. But there is a profound difference between entering that uncertain future with a plan that has room in it and entering it with a plan already crowded by avoidable obligations. Room is one of the most valuable assets in retirement. Room to delay a claim, room to do a conversion, room to pay for care, room to help family, room to stay below a threshold that matters, room to take a large one-time expense from the least damaging source, room to decide rather than simply comply. 61 can buy that room if you respect it. Now let me say a word about the people who miss the window. I do not say this to shame them. I say it because the pattern is common and instructive. They are not lazy people. Most are diligent savers. They worked hard, they did the responsible thing for decades. Their mistake is subtler. They assume that because they were disciplined in accumulation, retirement will naturally unfold sensibly on its own. It does not. Accumulation rewards default behavior. Retirement punishes default behavior during the working years. The default setting can be surprisingly effective. Save into the plan, reinvest, stay the course, avoid stupidity. That gets you far. In retirement, the default setting can become dangerous because now order matters. Timing matters, tax character matters, thresholds matter, sequence matters. One kind of income contaminates another kind of planning. One delay creates another constraint. The old autopilot no longer works. That is why some affluent households enter retirement with unease rather than confidence. They did not fail at saving. They failed to transition from accumulation logic to decumulation logic, and that transition is often best made before the external milestones begin barking instructions at you. In that sense, 61 is a moral test as much as a financial one. It asks whether you are willing to think before the world forces you to think. It asks whether you can act without the drama of a visible deadline. It asks whether you respect silent opportunities or only noisy emergencies. That is a useful test of judgment in every area of life, not just retirement. I also want to say something about health, because too many retirement conversations are built as if the body were a side note. It is not. The years in which you have the most tax flexibility often overlap with years in which you still have more mobility, more energy, and more choices about how to spend your days. A badly designed retirement steals from you twice. It takes money in the form of avoidable friction, Then it takes freedom in the form of delayed action. I have watched people postpone decisions for the sake of one more year of certainty, only to discover later that certainty never arrived. The tax opportunity closed, and the years they meant to enjoy had lost some of their vitality. That is why I want you to feel the weight of this without becoming paralyzed by it. The goal is not panic. The goal is respect. Respect the clean year. Respect the invisible deadline. Respect the chance to act while several important systems are not yet fully colliding. If you are 61, the question is not whether you should do something reckless. The question is whether you are using the last clean year to install a wiser architecture. If you are past 61, the question is not whether all hope is lost. Of course it is not. The question is simply which parts of the architecture can still be improved and which trade-offs are now active. Good planning always helps, but great planning recognizes that some years carry unusual leverage. This is one of them. So let me leave you with the framework I would want in your mind tonight. At 61, you are not standing at the beginning of retirement. You are standing at the edge of the last year in which design may still outrun reaction. Use that year to see your accounts by tax identity. Use that year to decide how much of your future pre-tax problem should be solved. Now rather than later, use that year to coordinate healthcare taxes, gains, and future benefit decisions as one integrated system instead of separate chores. Use that year to decide what kind of old age you are buying, not what kind you hope for, what kind your structure is actually funding. And above all, use that year to become the right kind of person for retirement, not merely a saver or a steward, not merely a worker who built balances, an allocator who understands consequences, not merely someone waiting for government milestones. Someone who moves before the milestone turns into a trap. That is what 61 offers. It offers the final clean chance to say, I will not let the next 30 years happen to me in the wrong order. I will not spend my 70s wondering why the system feels tighter than it should. I will not leave a large traditional account untouched, simply because touching it felt emotionally uncomfortable. I will not confuse inaction with prudence. I will not hand control to a sequence of rules just because those rules were still quiet when I had the chance to act. This is the final test. When a year arrives that gives you unusual freedom but no public drama, do you recognize it? Do you act while the room is still quiet, or do you wait until the voices are louder? The choices are fewer and the costs are heavier. That question will tell you an enormous amount about what your retirement will become. The households that answer it well do not merely save money, they keep command. And in the second half of life, command is worth more than almost anything you can buy.